My husband's cousin from overseas arrived. Then my son called her mom by accident. The morning fog rolled in from the San Francisco Bay like a whispered secret, curling around the edges of our backyard in soft, gray tendrils that seemed to hold the world in suspended animation, and I moved through my Tai Chi forms with the practiced grace of someone who had been performing this ritual for more decades than I cared to count, my body remembering the movements even when my mind wandered to the list of tasks that awaited me once the sun burned through the marine layer and declared the day officially begun. There was something profoundly peaceful about these early hours before the house stirred to life, before the coffee maker began its gurgling symphony and the sound of small feet padding across the hardwood floors upstairs signaled that my grandson Lucas had awakened and would soon be calling for his mother or, if he was feeling particularly affectionate, making his way down to my suite to curl up beside me on the sofa while I read him stories before breakfast. I had lived in this house for 3 years now, ever since Marcus and Jennifer had insisted that I move from my small apartment in Daly City into the mother-in-law suite they had renovated specifically for me, complete with a kitchenette I rarely used because Jennifer preferred that we all eat dinner together as a family, and a bathroom with grab bars that I pretended not to notice even though I appreciated the thoughtfulness behind their installation. The transition from independent living to this arrangement had been easier than I had anticipated, largely because my son and his wife had been careful to respect my privacy and my need for autonomy, understanding that an immigrant woman who had built a life in America from nothing but determination, and a teaching certificate that had required 2 additional years of coursework to be recognized in this country, was not someone who would accept being treated as helpless simply because she had reached what society deemed to be a respectable retirement age. My relationship with Jennifer had always been cordial if not quite warm, the natural distance that sometimes exists between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law who come from different cultural backgrounds and different expectations about family dynamics. Though I had worked hard over the years to give her space to establish her own household traditions while still maintaining my connection to Marcus and more importantly, to Lucas, who had become the unexpected joy of my later years in ways I had not imagined possible until I held him as a newborn, and felt the weight of generational continuity settle into my arms like a sacred trust. Jennifer was a good mother, attentive and loving even when her work at the marketing firm demanded long hours and weekend calls with clients on the East Coast, and she had never tried to limit my time with Lucas or make me feel as though my presence in their home was an imposition rather than a gift, which I knew from conversations with other grandmothers at the community center was not always the case in families where multiple generations attempted to coexist under one roof. As I transitioned from cloud hands to single whip, my arms extending in opposite directions with the controlled fluidity that had taken years to master, I caught sight of the kitchen window and saw that the light had been turned on, which meant that someone else in the household had awakened earlier than usual, and I wondered if it was Marcus preparing for one of his early morning video conferences with the development team in India or Jennifer getting a head start on the presentation she had mentioned was due at the end of the week. The rhythm of this household had become as familiar to me as my own breathing patterns, and I prided myself on noticing when something deviated from the established routine, a skill that had served me well throughout my life as both a teacher who could sense when a student was struggling even before they raised their hand to ask for help, and as a mother who had learned to read the subtle shifts in Marcus's mood and behavior that signaled when something was troubling him, even when he insisted that everything was fine and that I should stop worrying because he was a grown man perfectly capable of managing his own affairs. I completed my forms and stood for a moment in stillness, breathing in the cool morning air and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood gradually coming to life around me. The distant bark of a dog, the rumble of a garbage truck making its weekly rounds, the sharp cry of a seagull that had wandered inland from the coast in search of an easy meal from someone's unsecured trash bin. This was the life I had built through decades of hard work and careful saving, this comfortable existence in a safe neighborhood where my grandson could play in the backyard without fear, and where my son had achieved the kind of professional success that would have seemed impossible to imagine when we first arrived in this country with 2 suitcases and a determination to create opportunities that had not existed for us in Taiwan, where the economy had been struggling and where Marcus's father, my late husband, had seen no future worth pursuing before his sudden death from a heart attack when Marcus was barely 10 years old, had left me alone to raise a son in a foreign country with limited English and an uncertain path forward. I went inside through the sliding glass door, wiping my feet on the mat that Jennifer had placed there specifically for this purpose, and found Marcus in the kitchen standing at the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands, staring out the window at nothing in particular with an expression that I recognized immediately as the one he wore when he was preparing to deliver news that he suspected would not be well received. He startled slightly when I entered, which confirmed my suspicion that he had been lost in thoughts that were weighing heavily on his mind, and when he turned to face me with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, I felt the first stirrings of maternal concern that would only intensify as the day progressed and the careful order of our household began to shift in ways that I could sense but not yet articulate. "Ma, you're up early," he said in English, the language he defaulted to now after so many years in America, though he still spoke to me in Mandarin when we were alone and he wanted to discuss something that felt too intimate or too complicated to express in his adopted tongue. And I wondered if the fact that he had chosen English this morning was significant, or if I was simply reading too much into a casual greeting from a son to his mother in the kitchen before the rest of the house had awakened. "I am always up at this time," I reminded him gently as I moved to fill the electric kettle for my own morning tea, preferring the familiar ritual of loose leaves steeping in hot water to the quick convenience of the coffee that Marcus and Jennifer consumed in quantities that seemed excessive to me, but which I understood was simply the American way of managing the demands of professional life in a competitive economy. "You are the one who is up earlier than usual, and you have that look on your face that tells me you are preparing to say something that you think I will not want to hear. So perhaps you should simply tell me now rather than carrying this burden around all day while you work up the courage to speak." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound that lacked genuine amusement, and he set his coffee cup down on the counter with more force than was necessary, causing a small splash of dark liquid to spill over the rim and pool on the granite surface that Jennifer had chosen during the kitchen renovation 2 years ago, back when everything in this household had seemed secure and predictable, and the future had stretched out before us like a well-marked highway with clearly defined exits and rest stops. "Along the way, you always could read me better than anyone else," he admitted, reaching for a dish towel to wipe up the spilled coffee, his movements carrying a nervous energy that made him seem younger than his 38 years, more like the uncertain teenager who had once stood in our cramped apartment kitchen and told me that he had been accepted to Berkeley with a full scholarship, his voice trembling with a mixture of pride and fear about what this opportunity might mean for both of us. "That is what mothers do," I said simply, sitting down at the kitchen table with my tea and gesturing for him to join me, knowing that whatever he needed to say would come more easily if we were sitting together rather than standing in the awkward formality of people who were still deciding how to begin a difficult conversation. "We pay attention to the small details that others might miss, the way you hold your shoulders when you are stressed, the way you avoid eye contact when you are hiding something, the way you drink your coffee too quickly when you are anxious about time passing and events unfolding beyond your control." He sat down across from me, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other across the table, this son who had grown from a frightened child arriving in a new country into a successful man with his own family and his own secrets, and I waited with the patience that I had cultivated over decades of teaching students who needed time to formulate their thoughts before they could express them coherently. "I have a guest arriving tonight," he finally said, his words coming out in a rush as though he had been holding them back for so long that they could no longer be contained. "A cousin from Taiwan from my father's side of the family, someone who needs a place to stay for a few days while she visits doctors in the area for some medical consultations, and I told Jennifer about it last night and she said it would be fine, that we have the guest room and it is not being used, but I wanted to let you know as well so that you would not be surprised when a stranger appears at dinner tonight." I sipped my tea slowly, buying myself time to process this information and to examine the way Marcus was presenting it to me, the slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was not being entirely truthful, the way his eyes kept darting toward the doorway as though he expected Jennifer to appear at any moment and interrupt this conversation before he could finish whatever explanation he was attempting to provide. "A cousin from your father's side," I repeated carefully, setting my cup down on its saucer with deliberate precision. "That is interesting because I thought I knew all of your father's relatives, having been married to him for 15 years before he passed away. And I do not recall anyone named." I trailed off, waiting for him to supply the name that would either confirm or dispel the suspicions that were already beginning to form in the back of my mind like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. "Ichin," he said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Ichin Liu, she is a distant cousin, very distant actually, someone I only met a few times when I was young during family gatherings, but she reached out to me through social media a few months ago when she was planning this trip to the States, and I felt obligated to offer her a place to stay since we have the room and since family should help family, especially when they are far from home and dealing with medical issues in a foreign country, where they do not speak the language very well. The explanation was plausible enough on the surface, the kind of situation that could arise when modern technology reconnected relatives who had lost touch over the years and across continents, but there was something in the way Marcus delivered these details that made me question whether I was hearing the complete truth or merely the version of events that he wanted me to believe. "I see," I said neutrally, not wanting to push too hard too quickly and risk making him defensive or causing him to shut down the conversation entirely before I had gathered enough information to understand what was really happening. "And what kind of medical issues is she dealing with, if you do not mind my asking? Because if she is sick, then perhaps we should prepare the guest room accordingly, make sure she has everything she needs to be comfortable during her stay." Marcus's hands tightened around his coffee cup, his knuckles whitening slightly in a way that would have been imperceptible to someone who was not watching as closely as I was, and he took a long drink of his coffee before answering, using the gesture to buy himself a few extra seconds to formulate his response. "She did not go into specific details with me," he said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my left shoulder rather than meeting my gaze directly. "Something about needing to consult with specialists here in the Bay Area who have expertise that is not available in Taiwan, and I did not want to pry into her private medical information because that seemed intrusive and inappropriate, but she assured me that she is not contagious or anything like that, just needs to have some tests done and some consultations scheduled, and then she will return home within a week or two at most." I nodded slowly, acknowledging his explanation while simultaneously filing away all the small inconsistencies and evasions that would require further investigation once this Ichin Lu actually arrived and I could observe her interactions with Marcus and form my own conclusions about the true nature of their relationship and the real reason for her unexpected visit to our household. "Of course, family is important and we should help when we can," I said, rising from the table to rinse out my teacup in the sink, my back turned to Marcus so that he could not see the skepticism that I knew must be written across my face. "I will make sure the guest room is properly prepared, and I will do my best to make your cousin feel welcome in our home, even though it is unusual for such a distant relative to suddenly appear after so many years of no contact and to stay with family rather than in a hotel, especially when dealing with medical issues that might require privacy and rest." "Thank you, Ma," Marcus said, and I could hear the relief in his voice that this conversation was ending without the confrontation he had clearly been dreading, though he should have known after all these years that I preferred to observe and gather information before making accusations or demanding explanations that might not be forthcoming. "I really appreciate your understanding about this, and I know it is an inconvenience to have a stranger in the house, but it will only be for a short time, and Ichin is very quiet and polite. I am sure she will not disrupt our normal routine too much." I turned back to face him, studying his expression for one more moment before responding, and what I saw there troubled me more than anything he had said during our conversation, a mixture of guilt and fear and something else that I could not quite identify but which reminded me of the way he had looked as a teenager when he had made a mistake and was waiting for the consequences to catch up with him. "We will manage," I assured him, reaching out to pat his hand in a gesture of maternal support that I knew he needed even though I was far from convinced that I had been told anything close to the truth about this mysterious cousin and her sudden appearance in our lives. Family is complicated, especially when separated by distance and time, but we do what we must to honor our obligations and maintain our connections, even when those connections might bring complications that we did not anticipate or invite. He left shortly after that conversation to get ready for work, and I stood alone in the kitchen as the morning light finally broke through the fog and illuminated the familiar space with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances and the photographs on the refrigerator showing Lucas at various stages of his young life, smiling and innocent and completely unaware of the adult complexities that swirled around him like invisible currents in a deceptively calm ocean. I had learned over the years to trust my instincts about people and situations, and everything about Marcus's behavior this morning had triggered warning bells that I could not ignore. The nervous energy, the avoiding of eye contact, the explanation that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, the insistence on emphasizing how distant and barely known this cousin was while simultaneously feeling obligated to offer her accommodation in our home for an unspecified period of time. Something was not right, something was being hidden from me and from Jennifer. And I made a mental note to pay very close attention to this Ichin Lu when she arrived tonight, to watch how she interacted with Marcus, to listen to the way she spoke about their shared family history, To observe all the small details that people revealed about themselves and their relationships when they thought no one was watching closely enough to notice the truth beneath the surface of whatever story they were trying to tell. The sound of small feet on the stairs announced Lucas's arrival before he appeared in the doorway, his dark hair standing up in all directions and his favorite stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm, and his face lit up with the pure, uncomplicated joy that only a 5-year-old child can express upon seeing someone they love waiting for them at the start of a new day. "Nai Nai," he called out, using the Mandarin term for paternal grandmother that we had taught him from birth, and he ran across the kitchen to throw himself into my arms with the complete trust and abandon that made my heart swell with a love so fierce it sometimes frightened me with its intensity. "Good morning, my little treasure," I murmured into his hair, holding him close and breathing in the sweet scent of child and sleep and innocence, and I thought about how this boy deserved to grow up in a household built on honesty and trust rather than secrets and evasions, how he deserved to know the truth about his family and his history rather than being fed carefully constructed lies designed to protect him from complications that the adults in his life had deemed too difficult to explain. "Are you ready for breakfast? Or do you want to sit with Nai Nai for a while and wake up slowly?" "Sit with you," he said predictably, settling into my lap with his rabbit and his thumb finding its way to his mouth, a habit that Jennifer was trying to break but which I secretly encouraged during our private moments together because I knew all too well how quickly these years of innocent dependency would pass and how much I would miss them when he grew too old and too self-conscious to seek comfort in his grandmother's embrace. We sat together in the quiet kitchen as the morning unfolded around us, and I wondered what changes this day would bring to our carefully ordered lives, what truths would eventually emerge from whatever deception Marcus was attempting to maintain, and how I would navigate the difficult waters ahead when the mysterious Ichin Lu arrived at our door tonight, and whatever secret she carried with her from across the ocean finally came to light in ways that would test the bonds of our family and challenge everything we thought we knew about loyalty and love and the complicated legacy of choices made long ago in a different country under circumstances that none of us could fully understand from our current vantage point in this comfortable American kitchen with its modern appliances, and its illusion of security, and its assumption that the past could be neatly compartmentalized and kept separate from the present if only we tried hard enough to maintain the boundaries we had constructed to protect ourselves from uncomfortable truths. The airport terminal hummed with the peculiar energy of a place where endings and beginnings collided in an endless cycle of departures and arrivals, where families embraced with tears of joy or sorrow depending on whether they were greeting loved ones or saying goodbye. And as I stood with Marcus, Jennifer, and Lucas in the departure area of San Francisco International Airport, our boarding passes clutched in hands that trembled slightly with the weight of everything that had transpired over the past 2 weeks and everything that still lay ahead of us in the uncertain future we were about to step into, I found myself reflecting on the strange and circuitous path that had brought us to this moment of reckoning and reconciliation. The journey from that morning when Marcus had first told me about his mysterious cousin, to this moment of collective decision to fly together to Taiwan, had been marked by revelations that had shattered the carefully constructed facade of our family life, and forced us all to confront truths that we had been avoiding or concealing for reasons that seemed less justifiable with each passing day. And I thought about how Lucas's innocent slip of the tongue, that single word "mama" spoken without guile or awareness of its devastating implications, had been the catalyst that brought all of Marcus's carefully guarded secrets tumbling down like a house of cards that had never been as stable as we had all pretended it was during the years when we chose comfort over honesty and peace over truth. Ichin had left for Taiwan 3 days ago, her departure marked by tears and gratitude and a promise that she would prepare Olivia for our arrival, that she would try to explain to her 14-year-old daughter that the father who had been largely absent from her life was not abandoning her again but was instead coming to save her life by donating a kidney that would give her a chance at a future that had seemed increasingly unlikely as her condition had deteriorated over the past year while her mother had exhausted every other option before finally summoning the courage to cross an ocean and disrupt the life that Marcus had built in America on a foundation of omissions and carefully maintained silences about a past that he had convinced himself could remain separate from his present if only he was vigilant enough in keeping the two worlds from ever touching or overlapping in ways that would expose the lie at the heart of his carefully constructed identity. Jennifer stood beside me now, her face composed but her eyes revealing the emotional toll that the past 2 weeks had taken on her. The discovery of her husband's previous marriage and hidden daughter, The anger and betrayal that had threatened to destroy their relationship entirely before she had made the difficult decision to accompany him to Taiwan, not because she had forgiven him, or because their marriage had been magically repaired through conversations and counseling sessions that had barely begun to scratch the surface of the hurt and mistrust that now existed between them, but because she had looked at the photographs of Olivia and had seen a sick child who needed help and had made the choice that I had known she would make, because despite her anger and her justified sense of betrayal, Jennifer was fundamentally a person who could not turn away from suffering when she had the power to alleviate it, even when that suffering belonged to the child of her husband's deception. "Are you sure you want to come, Ma?" Marcus asked me in Mandarin, his voice carrying that particular tone of filial concern that suggested he was worried about my health or my ability to handle the stress of international travel at my age. But I knew that beneath this surface concern there was also an element of guilt about dragging me into the complicated mess that his life had become and forcing me to confront the existence of a granddaughter I should have known about from the moment of her birth 14 years ago, but whom I had been denied the opportunity to watch grow up because my son had made choices that prioritized his own comfort and his desire for a clean break from his past over my right to know and love all of my grandchildren, regardless of the complicated circumstances that had brought them into existence. "Of course I am sure," I replied firmly, reaching down to take Lucas's hand in mine as he pressed against my leg with the uncertain energy of a child who sensed that something momentous was happening but who lacked the full context to understand exactly what this journey meant or why the adults around him had been moving through the past 2 weeks with expressions that alternated between grief and determination, and a kind of exhausted resolution that came from making difficult choices that had no perfect outcomes, only different varieties of pain and hope mixed together in proportions that shifted depending on which moment you were examining and from whose perspective you were viewing the situation. Olivia is my granddaughter, and the fact that I did not know of her existence until 2 weeks ago does not change my responsibility to her or my desire to meet her, and to be present for this surgery that will, if we are fortunate and if the medical procedures go as planned, give her a chance at a healthy life that she deserves regardless of the mistakes and choices that the adults in her world have made over the years. Lucas tugged on my hand. His face turned up toward me with that expression of earnest curiosity that I had come to recognize as the precursor to one of his innocent but profound questions that had a way of cutting through all the adult complications and getting straight to the heart of matters that we had been dancing around with euphemisms and carefully worded explanations designed to protect him from harsh realities that we foolishly believed a 5-year-old was too young to comprehend or process. "Nai, will Olivia like me?" he asked, his voice carrying a thread of anxiety that broke my heart because it revealed that despite our best efforts to frame this situation in positive terms, he had absorbed enough of the tension and uncertainty that had permeated our household over the past 2 weeks to worry that this new sister might reject him or might see him as an interloper in a family dynamic that had existed long before he was born. I knelt down to bring myself to his eye level, ignoring the protest of my knees that reminded me that I was no longer as young or as flexible as I had been when Marcus was this age, and I could scoop him up and swing him around without thinking twice about the physical toll such gestures would take on my aging body. And I looked directly into Lucas's eyes as I spoke because I wanted him to understand that what I was about to tell him was true and important, and not just another comforting lie, designed to smooth over complications that adults found too difficult to address honestly. "Olivia is going to love you," I said with absolute certainty, speaking slowly enough that each word could sink in and be absorbed and believed. "She is going to love you because you are her brother, and because you have a good heart and a kind spirit, and because she has been alone for a long time without siblings, and now she will have you, and that is a gift that I know she will treasure once she gets to know you and once she understands that you are not taking anything away from her, but are instead adding something beautiful to her life." Jennifer's hand came to rest on my shoulder, a gesture of connection and gratitude that spoke volumes about how far we had come in our relationship over the past 2 weeks as we had been forced into an alliance born of shared concern for the children caught in the crossfire of Marcus's deceptions, and shared determination to ensure that whatever happened between her and Marcus in terms of their marriage, the innocent parties in this drama would be protected and supported and given every opportunity to build relationships with each other that were not poisoned by the adult conflicts and resentments that swirled around them. "Your Nai is right," Jennifer added, her voice steady despite the emotion I could hear lurking just beneath the surface. "Olivia is very lucky to be getting such a wonderful little brother, and I know that once she meets you and sees what a special person you are, She is going to feel so grateful that you are part of her life now, even though the way this family came together was not the way anyone would have chosen if we had been given the option to plan things differently. The boarding announcement for our flight crackled over the intercom system, the disembodied voice calling for passengers in zones 1 and 2 to begin making their way to the gate, and I stood up slowly, feeling the accumulated weight of my 62 years pressing down on me in a way that seemed heavier than usual, as though the emotional burden of the past 2 weeks had somehow translated into physical gravity that made every movement require more effort and more conscious intention than it normally did. We gathered our carry-on bags and our documents and began the slow shuffle toward the gate with Lucas between Jennifer and me, his small hand gripping mine with a trust that I hoped would never be betrayed the way that Ichin's trust in Marcus had been betrayed all those years ago when he had left Taiwan with promises to send for his wife and infant daughter, and had instead gradually allowed distance and time and his own cowardice to transform what should have been a temporary separation into an abandonment that had shaped Olivia's entire childhood, and had taught her that fathers were people who disappeared, and that promises were things that dissolved under the pressure of inconvenience, and the temptation of fresh starts unburdened by the complicated baggage of previous commitments. As we settled into our seats on the plane, with Lucas in the middle between Jennifer and me so that we could both attend to him during the long flight across the Pacific, I found myself thinking about the video call we had all participated in 3 days ago, that awkward and emotionally charged first meeting between Jennifer and Olivia that had been mediated by screens and translation apps and the careful diplomacy of Ichin, who had worked hard to frame the situation in terms that would not poison Olivia against Jennifer or make her feel as though the American family was an enemy that had stolen her father rather than another set of victims of Marcus's inability to confront his own choices and take responsibility for the life he had created in Taiwan before he had decided to create a new and entirely separate life in America. Olivia had been shy and wary during that call, her Mandarin rapid and accented in a way that was distinctly Taiwanese rather than the more standardized version that I had learned growing up, and her eyes had kept darting to Marcus with an expression that mixed hope and resentment and confusion in equal measures, as though she could not quite decide whether to see him as a father worth knowing or as a stranger who happened to share her DNA but who had forfeited any right to claim a meaningful relationship with her through his years of absence and minimal contact. But when Lucas had been brought into view of the camera, when Olivia had seen her little brother for the first time with his gap-toothed smile and his enthusiastic wave and his complete lack of guile or awareness of all the complicated history that surrounded his existence and his relationship to this girl on the other side of the world, something in Olivia's expression had softened in a way that had given me hope that perhaps these children, at least, could build something genuine and uncomplicated between them that was not tainted by the adult failures and deceptions that had brought them into each other's lives. She had smiled at Lucas, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face from wary and closed to open and almost vulnerable, and she had asked him in halting English what his favorite color was and whether he liked to draw, and Lucas had responded with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that was his natural state, telling her all about his drawings and his stuffed rabbit and his nai who made the best dumplings in the whole world, and for those few minutes the weight of everything else had lifted slightly and we had all been able to glimpse what might be possible if we could find a way to navigate through the wreckage of the past toward something resembling a functional family that acknowledged its complicated origins without being paralyzed by them. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and I closed my eyes against the familiar sensation of motion and the less familiar sensation of vertigo that came from contemplating all the ways this journey could unfold and all the possible outcomes that ranged from miraculous healing and unexpected reconciliation to catastrophic failure and permanent fracturing of relationships that were already hanging by threads so thin that a wrong word or a poorly timed revelation could snap them entirely. Marcus sat across the aisle from us, his face turned toward the window as though the view of the airport tarmac sliding past was somehow more compelling than the sight of his current family preparing for a journey that would bring them face to face with the family he had tried so hard to keep separate and compartmentalized in a different country, and a different language and a different version of himself that he had convinced himself could remain isolated from the American identity he had constructed so carefully over the years since he had left Taiwan as a young man with dreams of success and prosperity, that had somehow become entangled with shame about his past and fear that revealing the truth would cost him everything he had built in his adopted country. I thought about all the conversations I had had with Marcus over the past 2 weeks, the painful excavation of his motivations and his rationalizations for the choices he had made, His attempts to explain how a temporary departure had become a permanent separation, how regular financial support and occasional visits had seemed like enough of a connection to Olivia when measured against the demands of building a career and establishing himself in a competitive industry and eventually meeting Jennifer and falling in love and starting a new family without the complications of revealing that he already had a daughter from a marriage that had never been properly dissolved, but had simply been allowed to fade into irrelevance through distance and deliberate neglect. He had cried during some of these conversations, my son who had learned early in life to be strong and self-sufficient and to avoid showing weakness or vulnerability because we had been alone in a foreign country, and there had been no room for breaking down when survival and success required constant forward motion and unwavering determination to overcome every obstacle that presented itself in the form of language barriers and cultural misunderstandings and the subtle and not so subtle discrimination that immigrants faced in a society that claimed to celebrate diversity, while often treating outsiders as perpetually foreign regardless of how many years they lived in America or how perfectly they mastered the accent and the idioms and the unspoken rules of behavior that separated those who truly belonged from those who were merely tolerated. The plane lifted off the ground with a roar of engines and a shift in pressure that made Lucas grab for both my hand and Jennifer's, his eyes wide with the mixture of excitement and fear that comes from surrendering control to forces beyond one's understanding or influence. And I squeezed his hand reassuringly while thinking about how much of life consisted of exactly this kind of surrender, this acceptance that we could not control outcomes or guarantee happy endings but could only show up and do our best and hope that our efforts and our intentions would be enough to see us through the turbulence and the uncertainty towards something resembling solid ground on the other side of whatever crisis or challenge we were facing. Jennifer caught my eye across Lucas's head. And in that moment of shared glance there was an entire conversation about fear and hope and determination, and the strange bond that had formed between us as we had navigated the past 2 weeks together. Two women from different generations and different cultural backgrounds united by our love for the children in this complicated family drama, and our shared commitment to ensuring that whatever happened between Marcus and the various women in his life, the children would be protected and supported, and given every opportunity to know each other, and to build relationships that were not defined solely by the mistakes and failures of the adults who had brought them into existence. The flight stretched ahead of us, 13 hours of suspended time during which we would be neither in America nor in Taiwan but rather in that liminal space between destinations where normal rules seemed temporarily suspended, and where it was possible to imagine that the future might be different from the past, that patterns of behavior could be broken and new ways of being together could be established through conscious effort and genuine commitment to change. Lucas fell asleep against my shoulder an hour into the flight, his breathing deep and even and his face peaceful in the way that only children can achieve, that complete trust in the world and the adults around them to keep them safe and to navigate the complicated terrain of life on their behalf. And I stroked his hair gently while watching Jennifer stare out the window at the clouds below us, her expression unreadable but her jaw set in a way that suggested she was still processing everything. And still deciding what her relationship with Marcus would look like going forward and whether forgiveness was possible or even desirable when the betrayal had been so fundamental and so prolonged and had involved not just lies of omission but active deception maintained over years and reinforced through countless small choices to prioritize his own comfort over honesty and transparency. I thought about Ichin waiting for us in Taiwan, this woman who had loved my son and had borne his child and had then been abandoned to raise that child alone while Marcus built a new life that deliberately excluded them except for the minimum financial support, and the occasional awkward visit that probably did more harm than good in terms of Olivia's ability to understand who her father was or what his absence from her daily life meant about her worth and her importance in his hierarchy of priorities. Ichin had been so gracious during the confrontation, so focused on her daughter's medical needs rather than on her own justified anger at Marcus and at the situation, and I had seen in her a kind of maternal strength that I recognized from my own experiences raising Marcus alone after his father died, that ability to set aside personal pain and resentment in service of a child's needs, that willingness to do whatever was necessary to ensure a child's survival and well-being even when that required swallowing pride and asking for help from people who had hurt you and engaging with systems and situations that felt fundamentally unfair and unjust. The hours passed in that strange compression and expansion of time that occurs during long flights, where minutes can feel like hours during periods of discomfort or boredom, and where hours can disappear in what feels like moments when sleep or distraction provides temporary escape from awareness of the endless journey across the ocean toward a destination that grows closer with each passing mile but which still seems impossibly distant because the true destination is not a physical place but rather a state of understanding and acceptance and new beginning that cannot be reached simply by traveling through space, but requires also traveling through the difficult emotional and psychological terrain of confronting past mistakes, and accepting responsibility, and committing to different choices going forward. Lucas woke and slept and woke again, asking for snacks and entertainment and reassurance that we were really going to meet his sister, and that she would really like him and that everything was going to be okay. And I answered his questions with the patience and the gentle honesty that I hoped would serve him well as he grew older, and began to understand more fully the complicated circumstances that had brought him into existence, and the choices that the adults in his life had made that would shape his understanding of family and loyalty and what it meant to be responsible for the people who depended on you for love and support, and the kind of presence that could not be outsourced or delegated or reduced to financial transactions that absolved you of the harder work of actually showing up and being present in all the messy and inconvenient ways that true connection required. When the plane finally began its descent toward Taiwan Taoyuan International Airport, and I could see through the window the landscape of the country where I had been born and where I had spent the first 27 years of my life before immigrating to America in search of opportunities and futures that had not seemed possible in the Taiwan of that era, I felt a complicated rush of emotions that included nostalgia and grief, and a kind of homecoming that was bittersweet because I was not returning as the person who had left but rather as someone fundamentally changed by decades of living in a different country, and raising a child in a different language and becoming someone who belonged fully to neither Taiwan nor America but rather existed in that hybrid space that immigrants occupy, forever carrying both places within themselves and forever feeling slightly foreign in both locations because true belonging requires a kind of unquestioning acceptance of a single identity and a single set of cultural assumptions that becomes impossible once you have lived deeply in multiple worlds, and learn to see how arbitrary and constructed all cultural norms and values actually are beneath the surface certainty with which people within a single culture tend to proclaim them as universal truths. Ichin was waiting for us at the airport with Olivia, and the moment I saw them standing together behind the barrier where families gathered to greet arriving passengers, my heart clenched with a complicated mixture of joy and sorrow because Olivia looked so much like Marcus had looked at that age. The same serious expression and the same way of holding her shoulders as though preparing to face disappointment or rejection, and I understood immediately that this child had been shaped by absence and uncertainty in ways that would take years to heal even if the surgery was successful, and even if Marcus somehow found the courage and the commitment to become the father she had always deserved, but had never actually had in any meaningful or consistent way. Lucas saw them at the same moment I did, and he pulled free from Jennifer's hand and ran toward them with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that was his gift to everyone who encountered him, calling out, "Olivia! Olivia!" in a voice that carried across the crowded arrival hall, and made several people turn to look at this small boy racing toward a teenage girl who stood frozen in place as though uncertain whether to receive his enthusiasm or to protect herself from disappointment by remaining distant and guarded against this American family that represented everything she had been denied during the years when her father had chosen his new life over his obligations to his old one. But when Lucas reached her and threw his arms around her legs in a hug that was pure acceptance and pure joy at finally meeting the sister he had been told about, and had immediately embraced as an exciting addition to his world rather than a complication or a source of confusion, Olivia's careful composure cracked and tears began to stream down her face as she knelt down to return the hug, and to look at this little brother who had done nothing to deserve being dragged into the complicated mess of their family situation but who had nevertheless shown up with open arms and an open heart and a willingness to love her simply because they shared blood and because love, at least in Lucas's 5-year-old understanding of the world, was not something that needed to be earned or justified or rationed carefully according to complicated calculations about who deserved what based on past behavior and past choices. I stood with Jennifer and Marcus, watching this first meeting between the siblings, and I thought about how children had a way of showing adults what truly mattered and what was ultimately just noise and complication that we created through our own fears and our own inability to simply be present and honest and willing to extend grace even when grace had not been earned or deserved through any conventional measure of justice or fairness. Ichin caught my eye across the space that separated us, And in that moment of connection between two mothers who had both loved the same man and who had both been hurt by his choices and his cowardice, but who had both also created beautiful children who deserved better than the fractured and dishonest family structure that Marcus's deceptions had produced, there was an understanding that transcended language and culture, and all the reasons we might have had to be enemies or rivals, and I knew that whatever happened in the coming weeks and months, we would find a way to work together for the sake of these children who had done nothing wrong, and who deserved to know each other, and to build relationships that were not poisoned by adult resentments and recriminations. The weeks that followed would bring surgery and recovery and difficult conversations and tentative beginnings of new patterns of relationship that would take years to fully develop and solidify into something resembling a functional extended family that spanned 2 countries and 2 languages and multiple complicated emotional territories that we were all still learning to navigate. But in that moment at the airport, watching Lucas hug his sister and watching Olivia's face transform from guarded wariness to tentative hope, and watching Jennifer step forward to introduce herself to this child who represented everything painful in her marriage, but who was also just a sick 14-year-old girl who needed help and compassion rather than judgment or rejection, I felt something shift in my understanding of what family meant and what it required from all of us if we were serious about honoring our connections to each other rather than simply maintaining convenient fictions that made our lives easier in the short term while creating enormous damage over the long term that we then expected others to simply accept or endure without complaint. My grandson had called Ichin mom by accident, a slip of the tongue that had shattered carefully maintained lies and had forced truth into the light where it could no longer be ignored or explained away. And perhaps accidents were really just truths that had been waiting for their moment to be spoken, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge from the shadows where we had been trying to keep them hidden because we were afraid of what their revelation would cost us in terms of comfort and certainty and the carefully constructed narratives we had built about who we were and what our lives meant. Now we faced the hard work of becoming the family we should have been all along, complicated and messy and spanning oceans and languages and the accumulated weight of years of mistakes and missed opportunities, but honest finally. Honest in a way that created space for real connection rather than the shallow facsimile of relationship that had been maintained through lies and omissions and the cowardly choice to prioritize peace over truth. And as I walked toward my granddaughter with my arms extended in welcome, I thought about how the only way forward was through complete honesty and complete acceptance of responsibility and complete commitment to doing better, not because we could undo the past or erase the pain that had been caused, but because the children deserved our best efforts and because love, real love, required showing up even when showing up was hard and required admitting fault even when admitting fault was humiliating and required changing behavior even when change was uncomfortable and demanded sacrifices that we would rather not make but which were nevertheless necessary if we were serious about creating something genuine and lasting from the wreckage of what had come before. The video call connected with that familiar chime that had become the soundtrack of our newly configured family life, and I watched as the screen filled with Olivia's face, her color better now than it had been during those first difficult weeks after the surgery when we had all held our breath and waited to see whether Marcus's kidney would be accepted by her body, or whether we would face the devastating possibility of rejection and the need to start the search for another donor all over again. From the beginning, she was smiling now in a way that seemed easier and more natural than it had been 6 months ago when we had first arrived in Taiwan, and she had looked at all of us with that mixture of hope and suspicion and barely concealed resentment that had been entirely justified given the circumstances that had brought us into her life. And behind her I could see the familiar surroundings of her bedroom in Taipei with its posters of K-pop groups, and the desk where she did her homework in the bookshelf that Ichin had told me was overflowing with novels that Olivia devoured at a rate that reminded me of Marcus at that age, when he too had used books as a way of exploring worlds beyond the limitations of his immediate circumstances. Nai, is Lucas there? Olivia asked in Mandarin that had become increasingly peppered with English phrases as she worked with the tutor that Marcus was now paying for, not as a substitute for his presence but as a supplement to the regular visits he had been making to Taiwan every 6 weeks, trips that Jennifer had insisted upon as one of the non-negotiable conditions of their continued marriage, along with ongoing couples therapy and a commitment to absolute transparency about his past and his present and his feelings and his struggles with the guilt that still sometimes overwhelmed him when he allowed himself to fully comprehend the years of Olivia's childhood that he had missed and could never recover or repair no matter how present he tried to be going forward. I want to show him the drawing I made of all of us together, The one I told him about last week when we talked. I adjusted the laptop camera and called for Lucas, who came running from the family room where he had been building an elaborate fortress out of blocks with the intense concentration that he brought to all his creative projects, and he climbed into my lap with practiced ease and pressed his face close to the screen, his smile enormous and genuine in that way that still had the power to make my heart swell with gratitude that at least one person in this complicated family had been spared the burden of years of deception and hurt, and could approach these relationships with uncomplicated affection and enthusiasm. Olivia, did you get the package I sent you? Mama helped me pick out the stickers because she said you would like the sparkly ones, and Nai put in some of her special cookies that she made just for you, the ones with the red bean paste that you said you liked when we were there. I got it yesterday and the cookies are so good. I already ate 3 of them and Mama said I have to save the rest to share with her, but I don't know if I can wait that long because they're really, really delicious, Olivia replied, holding up the drawing she had mentioned, a colorful rendering of our entire extended family that included her and Ichan in Taiwan and Marcus and Jennifer and Lucas and me in California, all of us connected by a rainbow that arced across the ocean between the 2 locations, and I felt tears prick at my eyes because this child who had every reason to be bitter and angry and closed off from the family that had failed her so spectacularly had instead chosen to create art that imagined us all together in a way that transcended geography and history, and all the very good reasons she might have had to reject the whole complicated mess of relationships that Marcus's choices had created.